Hello and welcome to another episode of All Church Sunday School.
Sunday School.
I'm Shannon Moore, here with Renee Hoke.
Hey, Shannon.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Are you ready for another week?
I'm loving this book.
I am too. We're looking
addicted to it.
Peculiar Treasures by Frederick Buechner. Just
a biblical who's who.
Little stories about very interesting characters throughout the Bible. Lots of folks in our in-person class are reading this, and it's not a front to back. You can skip around, browse through. It's very, very interesting. So I've really enjoyed. I like Buechner anyway, but we're looking at a couple of very interesting characters today. Who are we talking about?
I want to tell you how Buechner describes Peter.
Okay.
And some significant scenes in Peter's life, and I have always really loved Peter and identified with Peter. Mm-hmm. But I'll say a little bit more about that. And then who else?
And then I'm going to be talking about another disciple, Judas.
So we have a range of disciples.
Probably the widest range, don't you think?
I think so. I absolutely think so. Tell me if you would describe Peter in a couple of sentences.
Honestly, Peter kind of gets on my nerves. I think he's sort of aggressive, a know-it-all, but I think he's really passionate. I think he wants to do the right thing. He wants to, he's a team player. But the character really, honestly, has kind of annoyed me as I've read about him over the years.
Do you also have a bias against him because he was a fisherman? You don't like to go fishing, do you?
I hate to go fishing, but
I knew it.
But a lot of my family members, my dad, loved to fish, and my grandma loved to fish, but I never did. Oh, I hated it. It's so boring. Do you like it?
No, I like the peace and quiet of just floating on the water.
Yeah.
I'd be happy for other people to fish, and I could just read a book.
But Peter didn't do it for fun.
No, he worked hard. He was hard-working, hard-working man. And I just have to say that part of the reason that I picked Peter for this week is I love what Frederick Buechner is going to say about the special name that Jesus gave Peter and the recognition.
Well, now I feel a little bad about how I talked about Peter, but I was just being honest. But he's a good guy.
I think he represents to me how hard it is to follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. And every time I'm disappointed with my ability to stay aligned with what I know is important from the teaching of Jesus, I think that Peter got that. He tried really hard.
And every time he thought he had it figured out,
and he just
didn't.
Bumping his head up against
and I can identify
with
that. Yeah.
So I guess I think there's some encouragement in the stories that we have of Peter, some encouragement for anyone whose faith journey isn't what they really wanted it to be, that God can use all kinds of people.
Right.
So let's just dive in.
Okay.
And would you read a little bit
Absolutely.
of what Buechner says to introduce Peter?
Okay. Everybody knows he started out as a fisherman. He lived with his wife in Capernaum, where they shared a house with his mother-in-law and his brother Andrew. He and Andrew had their own boat and were in business with a couple of partners named James and John, Zebedee's sons. The first time Jesus laid eyes on him, he took one good look and said, "So, you're Simon, the son of John." And then Jesus said that from then on, he'd call him Cephas, which is Aramaic for Peter, which is Greek for rock.
Now, there is a little essay that you're going to read for us about that name, rock.
Okay.
We think of it, and upon that rock I will build my church. Mm-hmm. We remember that quote from the Gospels. But just calling Peter a rock leads Buechner. I think this is just such a great illustration of his talent as a writer, to take that exchange between Jesus and Peter and speak to Peter's life using that image of a rock. So read it for us, and then we'll talk about it.
A rock isn't the prettiest thing in creation, or the fanciest, or the smartest. And if it gets rolling in the wrong direction, watch out. But there's no nonsense about a rock, and once it settles down, it's pretty much there to stay. There's not a lot you can do to change a rock, or crack it, or get under its skin, and barring earthquakes, you can depend on it about as much as you can depend on anything. So Jesus called him the rock, and it stuck with him the rest of his life. He could stop fishing for fish, Jesus told him. He'd been promoted. From there on out, people were to be his business. Now he could start fishing for them.
What do you think about that essay on rock?
Like that.
Isn't that lovely? And that sturdiness, that kind of steadiness. Don't you think Peter may have gotten it wrong a lot, but he was clearly all in.
Mm-hmm.
No one could doubt his conviction, right?
No, well,
he may not have listened well. Well, there were times when he tripped,
Yeah.
but always.
but he always came.
Until he was really frightened there at the end. And I didn't include that scene, but Buechner's going to make reference to it. But right around, read a few more pages for us.
There was a lot of talk going around about who Jesus was and who he wasn't, and Jesus himself seemed just as glad to steer clear of the subject. Then one day he brought it up himself, and the disciples batted it around for a while. There were some people who said he was John the Baptist come back from the grave, they told him, or maybe Elijah or Jeremiah or some other prophet who thought he'd see what he could do a second time around. There were all kinds of half-baked theories, they said. Then Jesus put it to them straight. Who do you say that I am? Nobody wanted to stick his neck out, and the silence was deafening till Peter broke it, or till it washed up against the rock that Peter was and broke itself. I love that.
I love that.
You're the Christ, he said, the Son of the living God. It took a lot of guts to say, and Jesus knew it did. If it was true, it was enough to blow the lid off everything. If it wasn't true, you could get yourself stoned to death as a blasphemer for just thinking it. But Peter said it anyway, and Jesus made up for him the only beatitude he ever made up for a single individual. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, which means Simon, son of John.
Did you think of that as a beatitude?
I didn't.
I think that's just, and you're cheering as you're reading through the gospel. You cheer when Peter gets it right because he's been fumbling and not, and this time
And to think how
he
much
makes
trouble
the good confession.
he could have gotten in
Yes.
for proclaiming that. You're the Christ.
And you have to love this idea that the silence was deafening until it washed up against the rock that Peter was. I love it. I love it. All right, now keep reading. It's about to take a bad turn.
Uh-oh. If Peter was the only one Jesus ever gave a beatitude of his own to, he was also the only one he ever gave hell to, at least in quite such a direct way. It happened not so long afterwards. Jesus was saying that to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, wasn't going to be a bed of roses all the way. And the time wasn't far off when he'd suffer the tortures of the damned in Jerusalem and be killed. Peter couldn't take it. God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen, he said. And that's when Jesus lit into him. Get behind me, Satan, Jesus said, because the rock that Peter was at that point was blocking the grim road that Jesus knew he had to take, whether he or Peter or anybody else wanted it that way or not, because God wanted it that way, and that was that. You're not on God's side, but men's, he said. You're a rock I've cracked my shins on. It wasn't the last time Peter said the wrong thing either, or asked the wrong question, or got the wrong point, or at least failed to do the thing that was right.
So we have one more scene, the very last scene, Jesus on the shoreline as the... How is it that Jesus is out there on the shoreline? This is after his resurrection.
This is after the resurrection.
Right. What is Jesus doing out there? He's waiting for the fishermen because they were just
They've gone back fishing.
They knew nothing else to do but, well, let's just do what's familiar. Let's go fish.
Yeah. Do you think it was a comforting thing for them, or do you think... I've often wondered if they were like, well, that didn't work out, so now we're fishermen again.
It does seem as if they have returned to
their job,
their previous life,
Yep.
and their livelihood, and so maybe it's kind of comfort, but it's surrendering. It's them not exploring what it means to be a follower of Jesus on the other side. So it seems a little like surrender to me. Well, I guess we'll just go. We know how to make a living. We can go back and.
I wonder what Peter's wife and mother-in-law. They were probably glad he went back to
Maybe
work.
they're the reason that he went back fishing. They were like, "Hey, we need to buy some groceries here," and
Yep.
So anyway, they are in the boat, and this is the last conversation that Peter and Jesus have. Would you read it for us?
I will. It was on the beach at daybreak. Some of the other disciples were there, and Jesus cooked them breakfast. When it was over, he said to Peter, only again he called him Simon, son of John, because if he ever meant business, this was it. Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter said he did. Then Jesus asked the same question a second time, and then once again, and each time Peter said he loved him, 3 times in all, to make up for the other 3 times when he denied him. Then Jesus said, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. And you get the feeling that this time Peter didn't miss the point.
One more sentence.
From fisher of fish to fisher of people to keeper of the keys to shepherd. It was the Rock's final promotion, and from that day forward, he never let the head office down again.
I love it.
Great.
I love it.
Good
So sweet. And those 3 times of, yes, Lord, I love you, to go for the 3 times that.
And it really
Peter
hurt
said.
Peter's feelings that Jesus kept asking him, you know that I love you, he said.
Wondering why he didn't believe him, but that rhythm of 3 compensated for 3 times that Peter said he didn't know who Jesus was.
Right. Jesus knew what he was doing, didn't he?
This is a lovely scene, and I love that rock. The Rock's final promotion.
I know. And that the remorse turned into redemption.
It just, yes, that's just a wonderful scene in Scripture. And more encouragement for us as followers.
I think so. You ready to move on to the next
Yes, is this going to be
disciple?
encouraging? I don't think so.
This might not be as encouraging, but it's very interesting. We're talking about Judas, and I put an exclamation point. Makes it like a musical. Judas, the musical. No, you're not buying it?
No, that could be a musical. I can see it.
So this is a detail. I wanted to start with showing this. Of course, most of us are familiar with Da Vinci's Last Supper, but I didn't know that there is a life-sized copy of Da Vinci's Last Supper by Raffaelli.
Oh,
Did
I
you
didn't
know
know
that?
No.
It was commissioned by Napoleon in 1809.
A life size.
It was not
Wow.
finished before Napoleon's abdication. Francis II of Austria bought it, wanting to install it in the Belvedere in Vienna, but it was too large for the building, and so it was donated by Emperor Ferdinand I to the Italian congregation in Austria, and it was set up in that church on the north wall, and there it is to this day. It is a mosaic, 9.1 by 4.47 meters, and weighs approximately 20 tons.
Holy smokes, 20 tons.
I don't know the metric system, so that's 30 by 14 feet.
You
I had to look
calculate.
it up.
Thank you very much. 20 tons is just, I
Isn't
can't
that
even
crazy?
imagine.
Yeah. But you can see Judas there holding the money bag. He's seated there with his hands on the bag. Judas is included in all 4 of the Gospels as one of the 12 disciples. In the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he is included as one just like everybody else that were sent out to with powers over unclean spirits and healing and teaching. But in the Gospel of John, he's differentiated as a devil. Jesus says that one of you is a devil. Jesus doesn't say it's Judas, but the narrator does. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about Judas here, what he did.
I think that we believe now that he was more radical, needed for Jesus to be more of an insurrectionist.
Right. And
was
Buechner's
disappointed that
Yeah.
Jesus didn't have more of a scorched earth policy and decided to take matters into his own hands. Some people think, perhaps, that if he jolted Jesus enough, Jesus would try to conquer Rome like Judas hoped would happen. And so it was a disappointed person who decided to take the opposite side at the end of Jesus'
his legacy
earthly
is one
ministry.
of betrayal.
Right.
I mean, his very name is associated forever with betrayal. We know that he was the treasurer for the disciples, and Matthew states very clearly that he betrayed Jesus for a bribe, for 30 pieces of silver. But I found this quote from a New Testament scholar named Bart Ehrman. Will you read what he says about Judas?
Judas' betrayal is about as historically certain as anything else in this tradition, pointing out that the betrayal is independently attested in the Gospel of Mark, in the Gospel of John, in the book of Acts. He contends that it is highly unlikely that early Christians would have made the story of Judas' betrayal up, since it could reflect poorly on Jesus' judgment in choosing him as a disciple.
I thought
That's
that
a
was
very interesting insight.
Interesting, because we know that sometimes the gospel writers or the traditions, were embellished a little, and I thought that was
The fact that this person selected by Jesus had been a betrayer.
And why would Jesus? Was that a mistake? Was that part of a greater plan? Very interesting to think about. Read to us what Buechner says about Judas, if you will.
Nobody can be sure why Judas sold Jesus out, although he had a reputation for dipping into the poor box from time to time, so the cash may have been part of it. Perhaps he was worried about where he stood in the pecking order. He may also have been reacting to some imagined slight. Maybe he thought his job as treasurer to the outfit was beneath him. Another possibility is that he had gotten fed up with waiting for Jesus to take the world by storm and hoped that betraying him might force him to show his hand at last. Or maybe something of all of these was involved. Whatever his reasons were, the whole thing went sour for him soon enough.
And that was what you were saying, that he was tired of
trying
peace
to force Jesus' hand. Yes.
Yeah. And so keep reading.
Slipping out of the Last Supper before the party was over, he led the way to the garden. It was dark by the time his former associates showed up, and maybe for fear that he might scare them off if he had used any other method, the way he showed the soldiers which one was the one to jump was by kissing him.
And so we have a picture here by Bondone from the 1300s, The Kiss of Judas. And that's such an intimate thing, and it's insult to injury, don't you think?
Yes.
To betray somebody with an act of affection.
I think that's the deepest cut of all, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That kind of intimate betrayal, to be on the inside and then to be the betrayer.
Right. Even if he had different intentions, that's a deep, deep cut. What do you think about this piece of art?
I think that piece of art is in our gallery.
Is it really?
I think so.
I think you're right.
I stop and look at it every time I pass.
It is
that way.
Yes.
Because you can't take your eyes off of it.
Because I don't know how closely we can see it on the screen, but it is a very intimate moment in this, and there's a lot of chaos and violence surrounding, but with Judas and Jesus, there's this very intimate.
They both have their eyes fixed on each other.
They both know what the
Jesus,
other know.
you can see in Jesus' face his do what you need to do. Mm-hmm. Go ahead and do it. His dismissal or his confrontation. Don't you know Judas remembered that moment for the rest of his life?
Mm-hmm. And even how he's embracing him. I mean, I've never imagined an embrace. I just sort of imagined him walking up and kissing him on the cheek or something, but
And you're right, all hell is breaking loose all around them. But it's as if they've totally...
like a freeze frame of the two of them.
Powerful.
So after, this goes down and Jesus is arrested and they find out that Jesus is going to be crucified. In Matthew's gospel, Judas is remorseful, and he tries to return the money to the priests that from whom he took the bribe, and then he completes suicide by hanging himself. Then the priests when they wouldn't take the money back, he just threw the money down on the floor, and then they took that money and bought a potter's field where you bury strangers. Now, in the book of Acts, Judas used the money to buy a field, and then he fell down, and it's a gross,
Fatal
grisly death. That field also became a potter's field, but in the book of Acts, it was an accidental death.
So there's some
there was no
overlap there
remorse.
between those two stories,
Right.
but
I like the Matthew version
I like to think that
better.
he regretted what he'd done.
And I found this piece of art by Almeida of Judas's remorse. I think that says it all, don't you? I mean, his face, his body language, you can just see what did I do? And I love that scene in Matthew where he tries to undo it. I
Almost
didn't mean
panicked kind of in the way he's like, no, I can't.
Yeah. So tell us what Buechner says about Judas' remorse.
There is a tradition in the early church that his suicide was not based on despair, but on hope. If God was just, he knew where he would end up. If God was merciful, he knew there was no question that in a last-ditch effort to save the souls of the damned, Jesus would be down there too. Hell might be the last chance he'd have of making it to heaven. In any case, it's a scene to conjure with. Once they met in the shadows, the two old friends, both of them a little worse for wear after all that had happened, only this time it was Jesus who was the one to give the kiss, and this time it wasn't the kiss of death that was given.
Isn't that beautiful?
That's exquisite. Mm-hmm. Yes. And that is so redemptive.
Yes. And that is what our faith is about.
Of course.
And, we villainize Judas, we villainize other people, and so often we stand in judgment when we don't know how deep God's love is, how great the grace is. I just love how this
it's beyond
makes you
whatever
stop
we imagine
and think.
Yes, that I love that writing.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
Good ending.
Yep. Well, we've got one more week.
One more week, and we'll be talking about which characters in the Bible. Personally, I decided to pick the Queen of Sheba.
Because why?
Well, she's just glamorous and amazing, and she's part of a story. She's featured at a time in Scripture when she's a prominent figure. Mm-hmm. I mean, she's going to call on Solomon.
Yeah.
And I love the way Buechner describes her showing up at Solomon's palace. So I love the writing, but I also think it's one of those biblical characters who's bigger than life. So I thought I would like to end with the Queen of Sheba.
Well,
how about you?
Well, we've often found some kind of connecting thread between the characters that we look at during this series, but I think this is going to be one of those. And now for something completely different.
This is going to be hard.
I'm going to look at Thomas. Doubting Thomas.
I love Thomas.
I do too. And
I always root for Thomas.
I do too. So maybe we'll find that connecting thread. And then what are we doing?
I like that challenge.
What are we doing after that?
And then we're going to turn to the book of James in the New Testament.
Yep.
And spend some weeks. So maybe folks who are watching would like to begin to read James and be ready.
It's only 5 chapters.
Be ready with your questions for us, and we'll do our very best to dig into that book that's very practical. And I need a good dose of James right now.
Yeah, me too. So looking forward
It's
to
like
that.
tonic. It's like Dr. Pepper.
Well, I hope that you have enjoyed talking about these very interesting characters that we've looked at today, and that you'll join us again next time. And I hope you have a great week. See you later.